Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something pretty fundamental. It's something we barely notice most days. Why do we demand endings? For everything, really. History, our own lives, and yeah, especially the stories we tell. We're looking at this basic human need we seem to have, this drive to impose some kind of order, some coherent shape onto what often feels like, well, chaos. And our guide for this is some really foundational work in modern literary theory and even philosophy. We're drawing from Frank Kermode, specifically his incredible book, The Sense of an Ending, Studies in the Theory of Fiction. Kermode's ideas about how we structure time, how we structure reality itself, they offer these immediate insights, into everything from the 24-hour news cycle to just why certain stories grab hold of us and don't let go.
Yeah, absolutely. And our mission here in this deep dive is really to unpack that core observation from Kermode, this idea that the human mind is basically a non-stop story generator. We're constantly creating these things he calls frictions. And we do it apparently just to bridge this really uncomfortable gap, this void between the neat expectations we have in our heads and the messy reality of the world out there. So we're going to look closely at how this works. We'll focus on three key related concepts that Kermode really shines a light on. First, this deep psychological need we have for closure, for things to wrap up. Second, the dramatic function of the sudden twist, the reversal he calls peripeteia. It's a mechanism, really. And finally, this critical difference one we often blur between just simple, measured time, the clock's tick-tock, and time that actually feels meaningful, weighted.
Okay, wow. It sounds like we're looking at storytelling almost as a survival tool, not just entertainment. All right, let's get into it then. Starting with maybe the biggest fiction of them all, the end. Kermode makes this point, right? That we're basically creatures stuck in the middle of things. We're born, we live our lives, we know we'll die, but while we're actually in the thick of it, we have this constant, almost urgent need to define neat beginnings and, crucially, definite endings. Even though day to day, life just kind of flows, doesn't it? So why is that structure, this fiction of an end, why is it so powerful for us?
It's powerful because fundamentally, we seem wired to look for patterns. We need coherence. Kermode actually started exploring this by looking at one of the most persistent narrative patterns we have, apocalyptic stories, predicting the end of the world. And what's really fascinating isn't the predictions themselves, but the fact that they keep failing consistently.
Right, that happens over and over again throughout history.
Exactly. Think about it. If you set a date for the apocalypse, and the date passes, and, well, nothing happens. Logically, the whole belief system should crumble, shouldn't it? But it doesn't. What happens instead? People just shift the date, or they reinterpret the signs, or they tweak the framework slightly. And Kermode argues this constant failure and the adaptation to that failure shows something important. It shows that the idea of a meaningful end, the concept of conclusion, is way more vital to our psyche than whether it actually happens or not. It's that coherent pattern we're desperately trying to impose on the flux, on the chaos of just things happening.
Okay, but if the predicted end keeps failing, if that final definitive answer never actually arrives, why do we keep buying into the fiction? Doesn't that structure, that pattern, eventually just weaken or collapse under the sheer weight of all those errors?
That's a great question. And Kermode's answer leans heavily on the philosopher Hans Weicker, particularly his work, The Philosophy of As If. The idea is that the usefulness of the fiction is more important than its objective truth. These fictions aren't just tales, they're like structural hypotheses we use to navigate the world. Wenger argued that a lot of the stuff we use to build our understanding of reality, our symbolic structures, our concepts, might not be literally true in a scientific sense, but they're absolutely essential for functioning, for practical living. And Kermode takes this idea and applies it directly to narrative and how we make sense of time.
So let me see if I'm getting this right. The structures we create, the fictions, they're things we believe as if they were true, because without that as if, we just couldn't operate.
Precisely. They are, in Kermode's own words, useful errors. That's a key phrase. They're mechanisms, essentially, to keep life feeling meaningful, to fend off that kind of existential dread or despair that could set in if we really truly faced the world as just one meaningless event after another. The world itself, the mundo as he calls it, becomes a kind of fiction, a system we build by taking what we perceive as separate facts and weaving them into a narrative whole. It's like we have a choice, know nothing or impose sense. And we always choose to impose sense.
Okay, but hang on. The moment you talk about imposing sense, especially across a whole society, that raises some serious concerns, doesn't it? You mentioned Kermode himself points out the dangers inherent in these necessary
Yeah.
fictions. Where does that line get crossed? When does the useful error turn into a dangerous myth?
Yeah, that's the absolute core paradox here. Kermode is very clear on this. Fictions are incredibly powerful tools for organization. They can give us a sense of shared purpose, common understanding. But that same power, when it gets twisted, when it's directed towards excluding people or justifying destruction, can be utterly devastating. Kermode explicitly brings up the destructive myths, the really dangerous fictions that fueled Nazism as a prime example. I mean, those were powerful sense-making systems for the people inside them, offering ultimate meaning. But the cost was catastrophic.
Wow, okay.
So there's this constant tightrope we're walking. We seem to need these fictions, maybe even for species survival on some level. But when those shared stories become too rigid, too demanding of absolute belief, or completely detached from, basic human empathy and observable reality, they become incredibly dangerous, engines of harm. The ideal, Kermode seems to suggest, is maybe a kind of provisional fiction, one we hold on to lightly, knowing we made it and knowing we might need to adjust it.
That difference between the fiction that helps us live and the one that destroys, that's incredibly vital. And it suggests we're constantly kind of negotiating the plot, aren't we? The plot of our lives, of our societies, which actually leads us perfectly into the next bit. The mechanism Kermode highlights for how we handle it when our expectations about the plot fail, that sudden surprise.
Right, and this is where we get to use that fantastic Greek term, peripeteia.
Yeah.
Technically it just means a sudden reversal of fortune or circumstances within a plot, like in a play. But Kermode sees it as something much deeper. He suggests peripeteia is how literature, how stories kind of absorb and manage that tradition of apocalypse we were talking about. It's how we handle the repeated failure of expectations without just throwing the whole story out.
Okay, so the big ending we thought was coming didn't happen. But then, bam, something else, maybe unexpected but equal dramatic, happens instead. And that twist changes everything, but it still brings the story to some kind of satisfying, unified close. It's like the plot twist saves the narrative structure rather than shattering it.
Exactly that. It's the readjustment of expectations, as he puts it, when the end does not occur as we had expected. It's like the narrative engine that reassures us, even when things feel chaotic or unresolved, that yes, there is some underlying coherent shape to events, even if we got the details wrong along the way. Peripeity gives us pleasure, doesn't it? Because it hits us with surprise, but at the same time, it fulfills that deeper craving we have for structure, for unity.
Let's link this back to Vehinder again and the useful errors. If these fictional structures are useful errors, how exactly does peripeteia, the reversal, serve that usefulness? It definitely feels like an emotional payoff when you read a good twist, but Kermode seems to be pointing towards something more cognitive.
Oh, he absolutely is. It's not just about the thrill. Peripeteia is the mechanism that lets us carry out what he calls the experimental as if.
Mm.
Think about it. We're constantly trying out these hypothetical structures, these narratives, to make sense of the past and maybe try to predict the future. So when we read a story with a powerful reversal, or even when we experience something like that in our own lives, we're essentially trying on that fiction. We're testing it out. Does this structure help make sense of the big abstract concepts we grapple with? Love, death, loss, justice. Kermode uses the example, a really powerful one, of the death of King Lear in Shakespeare's play. Now, objectively, factually, that event is untrue, right? Lear wasn't a real person. He never died on a stage or anywhere else. And yet, Kermode argues experiencing that fictional death is immensely useful to us. Why? Because by engaging with that intense tragedy, we gain something. We connect the abstract idea of mortality, of loss, to something tangible, something intensely dramatic. And that helps us organize our own understanding, our own feelings about our own inevitable end or the loss of others.
Got it. So the fiction is full because it's factually accurate, like a science textbook. It's useful because it helps us structure these huge, fuzzy concepts. It lets us practice complex emotional and intellectual responses. Fictions are like mental scaffolding, and they don't need to be verified by experiment or data. They just need to work for us operationally. They only lose their power then when they stop helping us make sense or stop giving us that feeling of coherence, when they stop being useful for survival, basically.
Yes, precisely. They are tools for what Kermode calls temporal integration. That's another key term. They help us knit together what would otherwise be just a meaningless sequence of moments into something that feels like a meaningful whole, a shape.
Mm.
And this focus on time and how we use narrative, use fiction to kind of wrestle time into shape, This is really the final crucial piece of Kermode's whole argument.
Right. Which means we absolutely need to talk about the two different ways of thinking about time that Kermode contrasts. These seem central to his entire analysis.
They really are. He argues we experience and measure our existence using two fundamentally different kinds of time. And crucially, only one of them really allows for meaning. The first one is chronos, Chronos. Think of chronos as just mechanical time, quantitative time. It's the clock ticking on the wall, it's the calendar date, it's your GPS counting down the minutes until arrival. It's just the simple interval between moments, a sequence, tick-tock, tick-tock. It's often thought of as spatialized objective time. It just keeps going relentlessly, regardless of what you're feeling or doing. You know that feeling when you're stuck in a waiting room or on a long, boring journey? That's pure, unadulterated chronos, just time passing.
Yeah, and so much of modern life feels dominated by chronos, doesn't it? We measure everything, project deadlines, appointments, commutes, workouts. It's necessary for organizing things, obviously, but in itself it feels completely empty, meaningless in a deeper narrative or spiritual sense.
Exactly, it lacks quality. Which brings us to the second kind of time, kairos, Kairos. Kairos is qualitative time. It's not just about when something happens, but about the significance, the weight, the quality of that particular moment. Kairos represents a specific, meaningful point in time. It might be a moment of crisis, a turning point, a crucial decision, a window of opportunity. It's charged.
Okay, so if chronos is the clock ticking away while I'm anxiously waiting to hear back about a job, kairos is the exact instant the phone rings with the news. The moment that changes things. It's the time that matters, the time that feels loaded with significance and consequence.
That's a perfect way to put it. In the New Testament, for example, the word kairos is often used to talk about the fullness of time, not just a date on the calendar, but a critically significant season, a decisive moment ordained or ripe for action. It's passing time or waiting time, but it's time that's pregnant with meaning, thick with anticipation or significance.
And this presumably is where fiction performs its magic trick, right? Because what a plot does, is it takes that endless, meaningless, tick-tock sequence of chronos, and it breathes significance into it. It transforms it.
Precisely. Plot is the engine of that temporal integration we mentioned. It takes the raw, relentless flow of mechanical time and organizes it, shapes it, into something that feels meaningful, coherent, whole. Think about a novel. The events might unfold over, say, 5 years of chronos. But the plot doesn't just list every single second. No, it carefully selects and highlights the kairotic moments, the significant decisions, the crises, the turning points, the reversals. Those become the building blocks of the narrative structure. Plot, essentially, makes time matter by creating that perceived pattern, that sense of meaningful development.
And if we loop all the way back to where we started with those failed apocalyptic predictions, the mistake people were making was a kind of category error, wasn't it? They were trying to force Chronos, just a simple date on the calendar, a measurable point in sequential time, to act like Kairos, to be the ultimate, critical, meaning-laden end point. It's like trying to make a simple tick-tock moment bear the absolute weight of final significance, and of course it can't, so it fails.
That's exactly Kermode's point. His work really illuminates how constantly we blur these two modes of time in our own lives and our cultures. We desperately crave the arrival of a meaningful resolution, a satisfying kairos, to give shape and purpose to the often boring, relentless, and seemingly pointless passage of chronos. Our whole storytelling apparatus, our fictions, our plots, our deep-seated need for an ending, it's all fundamentally part of this very human struggle. The struggle to impose meaningful time onto what might otherwise feel like just meaningless flow.
Okay, so let's just quickly pull together the main threads from this deep dive into Kermode. It feels like there are three big takeaways. First, we've established that we rely heavily on what Kermode calls fictions, these necessary, useful errors, to structure a world that often feels chaotic, and maybe just to survive that potential existential emptiness.
Yes. And second, the specific structure of literary plots, especially that mechanism of surprise or reversal called peripeteia, that's the key tool. It's how we manage our expectations, how we readjust when the ending we anticipate doesn't materialize, allowing the useful fiction to carry on.
Right. And finally, the core function stories, maybe even human consciousness itself, is this transformation, turning that mechanical, measurable time, chronos, into time that feels integrated, qualitative, and ultimately meaningful kairos. The reason these patterns, these paradigms survive isn't because they're empirically true, but because our psychological need for coherence, for a meaningful pattern, is just so incredibly powerful.
Exactly. So the takeaway for you listening is maybe quite simple.
If you find yourself getting really uncomfortable with open endings, or messy narratives, or unresolved conflicts in stories, or even in life, you're probably just experiencing that very basic, very human drive Kermode identifies, the deep desire to escape the feeling of empty chronos and find or create meaningful kairos.
So, thinking about your own life, your own story you're living right now, stuck in the middle, ask yourself this. If peripeteia is that literary reversal, that plot twist that satisfies our need for shape and unity, what real-world event have you experienced recently that felt like one of those necessary readjustments of expectations? You know, a moment when the tidy ending you saw coming just didn't happen. Was that just more Chronos ticking by, or did it feel like a genuinely critical, meaning-charged moment of Kairos that actually forced you, maybe painfully, maybe productively, to change your own narrative? Something to think about next time you feel that urge to skip to the last page.